Okay, the Uniform Commercial Code. What is it? Well, it's a uniform code that is commercial. Sorry, I cracked myself up by saying that kind of stuff. Essentially, it's a body of terms and conditions that are out there to govern sales or procurement amongst individuals and even private companies out amongst the 50 states. So it's not exactly uniform, but it is essentially, there's a uniform commercial code that is acted or implemented in each of the 50 states. And so what happens is when I do a transaction, for instance, here in California with somebody else in California, the Uniform Commercial Code is the governing body of law, if you will, that covers that transaction. Now, most of the time, again, there's not anything done in writing between the parties or whatever. But say that the transaction does go awry, which is, again, the whole point of having some sort of contract. And we don't have a written contract, and of course, two parties, you know, my side is different than the other person's side. And so we would go, and if we were to take it to court, we would look to the Uniform Commercial Code to resolve those issues. So the overriding philosophy of the Uniform Commercial Code is that it's like a safety net. So you go ahead and do your transaction up here, and then if something goes wrong, there's that safety net that you can fall into. That's true even when you have written contracts in the commercial world. For instance, say that I was getting married, I'm not, but say that I was, and I was going to hire a wedding photographer. There would be a contract that would generally govern, you know, the photographer showing up and doing certain sorts of pictures or whatever. But say the photographer doesn't show up, and as a result, I don't have any pictures from my wedding other than the things that guests have shot. And so clearly that's going to be a significant thing. Well, if the contract doesn't really govern that sort of a thing, then in fact the Uniform Commercial Code will still be there. So even when you have a contract, what you'll do on the commercial side of the house is you'll look first to the contract and see if that contract will resolve the dispute or the disagreement between the two parties. If the contract does not have anything that addresses that particular disagreement or dispute, then in fact you will look to the Uniform Commercial Code to be sure to see if that resolves the issue. And generally speaking, the Uniform Commercial Code has enough terms and conditions in it or legal applications that it will resolve most disputes that occur in the commercial world. So in the Uniform Commercial Code, that's generally what most of us live in, the world that we live in our private lives. We go out, we buy things, it's the Uniform Commercial Code. Most of us aren't really aware that that's what's actually happening. You know, we just simply buy things, and most of the time things go well. And even when they don't, the companies usually that we do business with are generally very good at resolving disputes. For instance, if I buy a dress and I take it home and it doesn't fit, or I find that there is a lipstick stain or a tear on it, then I can take it back, and generally I can get my money back or exchange it quite readily. And so as a result, I don't need to really hire attorneys or, you know, head over to the Uniform Commercial Code. In fact, in my private procurement life, I don't think I've ever had an occasion to do that. I have had a couple of disputes where, and unfortunately this is true of most Uniform Commercial Code things, it was, I should have probably hired an attorney and gone to court or whatever, but the size of the transaction was such that it was just easier to write off the loss and to just say, well, lesson learned. So and I'm sure each of us have something of that sort. But say that it had been a larger item or whatever, then I probably could have gone to the courts and under the Uniform Commercial Code gotten some sort of remedy for a transaction that had gone badly. Now, the government, though, and this is again a very critical thing to understand, the government does not do business under the Uniform Commercial Code. There have been, obscurely, a very few times where government contracts did not contain everything that it could have, and the courts have looked to the Uniform Commercial Code, but that really is the exception rather than the rule. Part of the reason is the government is not a normal party. For instance, you know, if I'm doing business with Vaughn's or something, Vaughn's is a normal merchant and I'm a normal party. But the government is essentially the ruling body, the sovereign entity, if you will. And because of that, it's important to understand that there's different laws. The government is being held to a different standard than, for instance, one party is to another party. Now, those rules that the government has, there's rules actually to protect people or businesses that do business with the government, but there's also rules out there to protect the government from being taken advantage of by other individuals or companies that are out to soak the government for all that they can. And that's true at the federal level, the state level, and probably a little less so at the local level, simply because local governments don't have as much money or time to soak into having a lot of procurement rules or laws. But generally speaking, state laws will govern procurement at the state level, and federal laws will govern procurement at the federal level. It's a little bit difficult, and that's one of the things we'll address in this class, because there's 50 different states. Government procurement in each of those 50 different states is going to be different. It's not like the Uniform Commercial Code, where commercial procurement is uniform and it's hunky-dory, at least in the sense that it's all uniform and we feel good about it. But on the state level, there will be differences because each state has slightly different ideas of how procurement should go. At the federal level, and that's the good news about federal, is it is at least consistent amongst the 50 states if you're working for the federal government. Also good news is most states actually try to mimic the federal method of procurement. And so as we go throughout this class, and I come from a federal procurement background, we'll probably focus a little bit more on the federal. I will bring in some state-specific stuff, but interestingly enough, that most states will in fact follow the federal model quite closely, if not entirely, which frankly is not necessarily that great of an idea because the federal model is made for federal. There's a couple areas where the federal model should be in fact revised for state application, but at least following a model is better than not having a model at all. So that's essentially one of the main thing that we need to remember here is we have procurement that goes on in our normal lives, us and merchants, merchant to merchant, those sorts of things occur. And they can occur with the contract or without. In either situation, they will go to the Uniform Commercial Code. On the government side of procurement, it's government and some kind of either individual or business that's doing business with the government. But typically, the Uniform Commercial Code isn't there. There's this set of statutes and regulations and things of that sort that the contract will fall into first before any kind of Uniform Commercial Code application. So it's a very critical thing to understand.